our first question to the panelists is, what are your memories of the Soviet period, and what have you gained or lost going from the Soviet Union to the Russian Federation?
Значит, как воспоминания о Советском Союзе и вот с изменением Советского Союза, что как бы привнесено и что было потеряно.
Там не было счастливое детство.
Yeah.
Actually, when I was a child and I was born in Soviet Union, I had really happy childhood. It's true, because in Soviet Union, you know, it were two good things. It was safe childhood, детство, and the safe пенсионеры.
Retirement.
And the safe retirement, yes.
And also, I lived through that period of time as well, you know, so I remember when first visits for United States, you know, Gorbachev come to power when I was still in high school, so actually establishing of the Russian democracy, I was in college. It was very interesting. We actually did gain quite a bit of a sense of freedom, openness, opportunity to travel abroad, opportunity to decide your own future. In the same token, we had economic collapsation. You guys probably don't understand, like buying pair of tights for women was enormous amount of task. Have a facial cream was treasure. And for about 5 or 7 years, there was nothing in the stores. So there was takes and gains through collapsation of Soviet Union when everybody was equally, let's not say poor, but limited with some goods. However, right now, if you go to Russia, you can buy everything your heart desire. You can buy Ferrari, Maserati, you can buy luxury apartments as long as you have the finances. So now open market definitely changed country quite a bit.
Конечно, когда мы стали взрослеть, то есть стали взрослеть, мы стали понимать, что мы ограничены в чем-то.
And Professor Gabriel said that us growing up in Soviet Union, you don't really understood what you were missing out. With openness of the borders, the older we became, the ability to free travel, for example, when you don't have to go through visa approval system and be qualified. Who used to travel in Soviet Union? There was an artist who did folk dances, you know, music groups, politicians, and people of the top of the Communist Party. Right now, we understood that we were limited in amount of information. However, when you don't know what you're missing out, it's really hard to miss out on it, yes?
Очень тяжелым был период перестройки, но сейчас, когда этот период уже практически закончился, мы опять можем ощущать за своей спиной стабильностью и как-то строить план на
And Russian
будущее.
people do, out of the whole value system, really, really appreciate stability. So we may willing to sacrifice some of the democratical freedoms as long as we have stability in life. For example, perestroika period was quite devastating economically, because you never knew how much produce will cost every single day. So there was a lot of stress, a lot of uncertainty. And I think the last 7 years, Russians are happy to say it's maybe not perfect, but it's stable in Russia. And that is very, very important key value in society of Russian country and Russian people. Olga?
Нет, ну а что, ты все то же самое сказала?
So the Professor Znur said she agrees with everything we already said.
Не стремиться
Да,
выступать.
ничего страшного.
Okay, so the next question is, how did your feeling or sense of citizenship change from the Soviet period to maybe then to the 90s under Yeltsin, and then later after that under Putin and Medvedev?
Нет, зачем? Я не совсем поняла вопрос.
They don't.
I don't understand your
Oh,
question.
citizenship. So the sense of гражданство. What does it mean to be a citizen?
А что имеет
The
это
Soviet
значит
period,
гражданин?
It's all the same. You can feel we filled out the citizenship when we were in Soviet Union, and almost like that we feel the citizenship in present time.
If you're Russian, I guess, you know, that is kind of a question.
If you are United States citizen, you are United States
You're American,
citizen.
yeah.
It not depends from the time, you know.
What did you think of Yeltsin as a leader, as he represented your nation?
О Ельцине что ты думаешь, как о лидере?
He was good in certain time, and he did his job, but after that his time was over, so another leader
вносил свою лепту в развитие вообще всех международных отношений.
They're looking at Yeltsin more as a historical figure. You know, at the time, he obtained the power of the country, he probably was not perfect because he was a material of the old system. However, nobody else stepped up to the plate. And I guess Russians put a lot of hopes on Yeltsin. Some of them didn't fulfilled.
Конечно, для науки каждый наш президент, конечно, вносил большой вклад и позволял нам работать и общаться со
And
всем
as a
миром.
people of the university, as a higher education faculty and staff, they believe that at least Yeltsin understand the importance of the higher education. So there was a really big impact on quality of education. We still very proudly to say majority of our students at Russia study free, guys, in college. If you meet certain standards, there's no such things as a free education. Let's put it this way.
Да, скажу, что мы не
Yeah,
политики,
but
мы
if
люди
you
науки.
are a good student and you have really good score, CT score by the time you finish high school, and then you can still get your 5 years of college education free. No debts, no loans, nothing. So it's paid by government to you. So it's one of the wonderful relics of Soviet Union we still have. We have wonderful social programs. And Yeltsin actually did not touch higher ed. He allowed people to do research, invest money. Right now it's not as good because more and more we feeling pressure of free market. I will always compare higher education in the United States. It's more like run like a business, yes? Yes, how much money we're going to make from each student. You know, the more you change your majors, the more beneficial it's to university. Yeah. Да. Yeah. Christian, you were in Russia as well. So when we were at the conference, did you feel like kind of the same sentiment, like kind of frustration from the professors you talked to?
Yeah, a lot of. I delivered a paper at the Kazan. When was that? About a month ago, and I delivered it on Henry David Thoreau's essentially his approach to challenging government authority. And I wasn't sure how that would go over in Kazan, but generally I thought the presentation went well and it was well received by the students and the professors. Everywhere I went, I took a tour of the university, and one of the first questions that was always asked of me is, how do our facilities compare to what you see in American universities? They were very interested in comparing like what the pay was, what the facilities were, and from what I saw, I gave the answer. It was kind of a cop-out, but it was very true. Depends on how high level a professor you are. I mean, some of the facilities in the American universities will be much better in Russia, are much better than they are in Russia if you are a tenured track professor at a major university. American facilities, from what I saw, are better. But if you're lower on the totem pole in this country, you might very well end up with worse facilities. If you're a non-ranked adjunct professor who gets tossed around like garbage by a lot of universities in this country, you will have a worse situation than the average Russian professor. It all depends on where you are in the pecking order. That's my impression of what I saw.
Tracy, would you like to contribute? Because you visit several Russian universities.
Yes, indeed. I felt like there was such an interest on the part of the Russian students. They really wanted to know what we as Americans think about them as Russians. There's a lot of curiosity there. And when I went last, it was right after the election, and I went to go give a talk on, Lilia presented the Jim Crow Museum, and I presented our Museum of Sexist Objects. And they were really interested in our instructional techniques, so learning through working with artifacts and taking on these social problems of sexism and racism head on. Granted, it's something that we at Ferris do maybe more than the average university, but they were really interested in that as a pedagogical technique that you could work with material objects. But I think, you know, on the whole, if you're to compare the American educational system with the Russian educational system, generally speaking, the Russian students, K through 12, outperform American students. They just have higher standards, math usually 2 grades ahead. So Russia has, as our guests indicated, Yelena and Olga, as they've indicated, there's been this value of education, and that's certainly something that came out during the Soviet period. The whole idea of the Soviet experiment was you wanted to take this peasant country and educate them and catch up to the West. So the way to do that is through an educational system. And indeed, as they stated, during the Yeltsin period, they didn't give up on education, and certainly since 2000, that still remained a priority. And Kazan, which is a part of Tatarstan, where our guests are from, is a very natural resource wealthy area, and they, on top of Russia prioritizing education, they have even more so because they have a higher standard of living in Kazan than anywhere else in Russia. It's one of the highest
One of the highest standards, yes. And because Kazan is a very unique region, guys, we have fully bilingual society. There's two languages, state languages, Russian and Tatar. There are fully bicultural existence. The Tatar culture comes from the Eastern European, Asian, and also the Russian culture is quite, and also it's a very unique region in religious diversity. We have ratio to 51% of Muslim to 49% of Christians. So you actually see mosque and churches on the same street. You see people, children who grew up embracing both religions, ethnic marriages, bilingual kids, everything done in 3 languages. It's Tatar, Russian, and English now. So it's really friendly, very diverse region. And one thing I would like to kind of mention, when we are working on a collaboration. It has been in the pipeline for 3 years with FERIS. Unfortunately, FERIS is a bit sometimes slow, but we're working on it, working with 2 universities in Russia. And Tracy and I are planning to take students to Kazan this summer. So if you have any interest, please let us know. That will be a very unique program studying Russian language, studying culture of Russia, being in historical city, which have seen Ivan the Terrible and people before Ivan and very much after. It's a modern and history all in one piece. So we're using this as an opportunity to promote, yes, a little bit as well. Sure. And I agree with Tracy. Students understand value. From my personal experiences, coming 17 years here in Big Rapids and starting family here, my husband is American, my kids obviously are Americans. Idea of learning is supposed to be fun. It should be joyful. There's no such attitude when kids go to Russia to school. Understanding that mom and dad go to work, it's our job. Your job is to learn. So if you don't like it, suck it in. Okay, so it's absolutely no complaining. Russian kids go 6 days a week to school. Our Saturday is actually all the way from K-12 to the end of the university is working day. We only get Sunday off. It's how we get 4 years of additional education. And again, my personal experiences is Russian education, especially general education, is very wide. So if you finish college, you should completely be fluent in foreign language. You should know basis of philosophy. You should well know geography and history, even if you're a chemist, or you are a physicist, or you're a mathematician.
Заканчивая наш университет, можно работать как на производстве, как химический инженер, так и преподавать химию, так и в науке. Вот это специфика нашего образования.
Very kind of a multi-level. For example, Professor Gavrilo just mentioned that graduates of their universities are able to teach chemistry, able to work as a chemical engineers already in industry. Also,
Researcher.
they also can be scientists and do research. So they can be actually chemists at the lab. So it's not like American education is not good, guys, but I think it's much narrow. You're a really good specialist, but in one area. In Russian, there's a little bit more variety. So that's become better market value for your money and time spent.
Okay, good. Yeah. So I think we've determined that education, the value of education, has stayed pretty consistent the past 100 years. What has changed since 1991? Just, December 25th, 1991 was, 25 plus years ago, 25 plus a month, it's been a little bit of change. What changed in those 25 years, would you say? The biggest changes in your country?
Ну, расскажи хотя бы 2 примера.
Нет, хорошо. Во-первых, изменилось то, что наша система стала переходить на европейскую систему двухуровневого образования.
Just in education field or like in general?
Just in general.
Okay.
Education is still your priority, but what's changed?
No, we will address first, like educational system that Russia sends adopt European system of bachelor's and master's degree. That was the very big change to change the curriculum and make sure that our specialists can work abroad. Obviously, economy changed from planned economy to free market. So the market demand was very significant change. So there was a collapsation. If you know, Russia is heavily relies on the prices of oil and natural gas. So, but again, an ability to explore, travel around the world, that was really important for average citizen, not just the exclusive top, But
Нет,
anyone
это
right now
это
can.
очень важно как для обычных людей, которые могут поехать, посмотреть, что творится за границей, познакомиться с другими культурами, так и в сфере образования и науки, потому что это обмен опытом.
I'm trying to translate all at the same time, guys. So it says it's really important. The travel and ability to see the world is extremely important as educational tool, because then you become global citizen. You know different countries. You can contrast and compare. It's creates a critical thinking, but also for joy and appreciation of your own culture. Yes, I have been heavily involved with study abroad through Ferry State University. I know when students come back from countries like Russia or Italy, European countries says, oh my God, we come home, we have such big cars. Our stores open 24 hours, yes? We get service anytime we want. We have big houses. We have 3-4 bathrooms for a family of 2, yes? So that really puts everything in perspective. Same thing was for Russian. When I first traveled, myself as a graduate student, it was amazing that you certainly realize you need to speak language. It's really become clear understanding your own shortcomings. It's forced you to learn, to look for different outlets. You become less frightened of the things you don't know. So you start saying, okay, I don't know it now, but I will learn about different religion or different culture because I don't want to be offensive. I want to be respectful. And we encourage heavily at Ferry State, yes, guys, for all of you to please include that international experience as part of your education because you learn so much about you. I was traveling, when you can buy your own ticket in a foreign language, in a foreign country, and take a train from one city to another, my God, it's such an empowering tool. You think, I can do it, I'm like a big girl, I can do it.
Okay, so that's your take on 1991 to the present?
Yeah,
From the-
economy probably was the biggest shock, but
Yeah, I can see that. And Christian, as
Oh,
a,
Tracy, you were at Russia at the same time.
I was actually in Kazan. I don't need to talk about myself, but I was in Kazan on December 25th, 1991. So the official day that the Soviet Union collapsed, ceased to exist. So that was the day they lowered the Soviet flag and raised the Russian flag. I was actually in Kazan. I was just passing through Kazan, but I was right at the train station actually I was on my way from Kazan to Moscow on a train. I bought my own ticket. I was a big girl. And I was just, 22 years old? I was pretty young when I did all that. So yeah, I've been doing, studying Russia and traveling to Russia, working with Russia for, that means over 25 years now. I first went there in 1990, so I've seen a lot of these changes. And my heart really goes out to the Russians because these have been a hard 25 years. Every time there was a major transition like this, it's always the people at the bottom who take the hardest hit. Okay, so that's my perspective. I want to hear Christian talk about, he's an expert on U.S.-Russian foreign relations, what he sees as the maybe 5 most significant foreign relations events from 1991 to the present.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. It's such a topic I could sit up here and you could listen to me lecture for hours and just be like, shut up, shut up, shut up. All starts with this, I think. In general, I'm painting with broad brushes because it's a complex topic, but in general, countries have 2 very different understandings of what it meant for the Soviet Union to collapse. In the United States, we tend to see it as a vindication of our Cold War policies. The West won. Democracy, capitalism, we were the victors in the war. And if you look at the Russian reaction to it, it tends to be more of, in some circles, seen as a catastrophe, or some seen, even if it was a victory for the Soviet Union to collapse, at the end of the day, it would usher in a new partnership between the United States and Russia, where the United States would treat Russia as an equal partner with interests in essentially their, for lack of a better term, Eastern Europe and in Central Asia. That's not how many Russians feel that the United States has treated their country. And you could debate the merits of it, but I think these are the moments that really show the differences in how the 2 countries in general perceive the world. Most Russians, as far as I can tell, especially the leadership class, really have a problem with the expansion of NATO into former Warsaw Pact countries and into former Soviet states. I mean, the fact that NATO as an institution, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was designed to protect Western Europe from the Soviet Union. Many Russians see it as targeted against them. NATO has even expanded to former Soviet territory, the Baltic republics. And you can certainly debate how the Baltic republics got into the Soviet Union. It was our military occupation. But essentially, that is seen as part of not treating Russian interests with respect. Many people see that as essentially the Americans and Western Europeans taking advantage of their situation. And another moment that really you see different ways of viewing the world was in Kosovo, 1999. When NATO began bombing Serbia for the ethnic cleansing that the Serbian government was carrying out, many Russians saw that, especially President Boris Yeltsin, as basically an unfair attack on an important ally. President Clinton and Boris Yeltsin had very heated exchanges over this. And I can talk about more complexities of it, but people had a very different understanding. Americans saw it as penalizing a country that was carrying out genocide. Russians saw it as an unfair attack on an ally that basically did not have international sanction, because NATO is not the United Nations. Another major moment, I would say major moment number 2, took place in 2007 at an institution called the Munich Security Conference, which is in the news today. President Putin thought he had cooperated very effectively with President Bush on the war on terror, but didn't feel like he was getting much for it. Showed up in Munich in 2007 and gave a speech that literally stunned the attendees. As President Putin basically said, we in Russia don't recognize a unipolar world. We don't recognize that there's a superpower called America. That's a terrible world order, and it's dangerous for countries to think they're better than everybody else. And at the end of the day, America, what a hypocritical country, goes around and preaches human rights and democracy. It's amazing you don't seem to care about the human rights violations of your allies and only care about the human rights violations of Russia allies. Not to mention, why don't you learn how to practice democracy? You're going around the world torturing people. You basically have a kangaroo, they called the Supreme Court a kangaroo court. Why don't you basically stop being so goddamn hypocritical? And Putin likes to use colorful language, and he basically said your freedom agenda for the world is basically to not take Russian interests into account and change countries like the Ukraine and others to take us against us. You're not treating us with any respect. And to say this was a shocking speech is an understatement. But you could tell the two countries' interests were really divergent. And the last 3 areas I would point to, or number 3 at the end of the day, you've got what goes on in the Crimea recently. Crimea and Ukraine, the recent events there are big, big issues. I would also point to just the issue in and of itself, number 4, is the issue of the extent of Russian interference in the 2016 election. That is a huge deal. No matter what the actual truth of it is, that is something that touches a very sensitive subject in this country. And number 5, I just have to throw it out there because it just has to be the election of Donald Trump and what he has said about Russia during the campaign and in recent interviews. I mean, this is where I'll end, and I'm sorry if I've gone on too long, but I'm fired up here. Trump, whatever you think of Trump, in an interview, he basically made moral equivalence between the Russians' foreign policy record and the United States. When someone called Putin a murderer, a journalist, he said, what, are we so innocent? An American president to say that is unprecedented. If Hillary Clinton said that, I have no doubt there would be in the Senate right now calls for impeachment. For a person to equate the Russian foreign policy record with the US government in this country is so unprecedented, I can't even begin to encapsulate what that means. To compare Russia to the United States from a sitting president is, I'll stop. If you had said that that would happen 5 years ago, people would have thought you were crazy, but yet it happened a couple weeks ago. So that's where I'll stop my talk.
We'll just hand off the conversation then to Olga and Yelena and Lily and say, what was the perception of our candidates in Russia last fall, of Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump?
Интересно.
Just it was very interesting. It was very interesting for Russians to see. However, Hillary Clinton was personally well liked as a woman who definitely represents a lot of qualities. She visited as a Secretary of State Russia several times.
Мы помним ее, когда она была.
She actually came to Kazan and talked about the diversity and unique culture of tolerance. It says we would really like to transition that Muslim-Christian coexistence into Middle East conflict. So I think personally people respected her, but at the same time there was a sense of, because Russia is a very traditional country, that women in such high position, I don't see it's happening in Russia anytime soon. So they would maybe feel that maybe it was a job was not well suited for female. So with Trump, I guess nobody expected him to win in Russia, so it was really quite surprising to everyone. But Russian media did explain that it shows that America is very different. It's very unique. America is very capable of change, such certain change. Yes, it was such a clear prediction of favorite candidates through the entire campaign. And people spoke, and they spoke in such a way that, American journalists were shocked. I think everybody were quite surprised. I don't know. I was surprised at least, yes. And I think Russians were surprised as well. In the same token, they give a lot of credits to Trump, says he's a businessman. He most likely to find economic reasons to make better relationship with Russia. They said we will give him a very huge credit for running a very unusual campaign. And again, they see him as a voice of people, maybe the group of electorate would never had opportunity to have a spokesperson out there. I think our election process is really confusing to Russian, why each state has different amount of electoral votes, why not physical amount of votes cast count as the voice of people. So I had a lot of questions explaining, why certain states weigh more, some certain states weigh less. And my Russian friends respond, isn't everyone equal? Isn't that a free country? And I had a hard time explaining that. I said that technically, historically, I said it's BS, I'm sorry for my colorful language. I said, I agree, it's very confusing. But, if you're living somewhere in Kentucky and your state is not weighing as much as California, it's frustrating, yes? And, yeah.
Я хотела сказать, что независимо от того, кто выиграл президентские выборы, отношение обычных россиян к гражданам Соединенных Штатов, оно остается неизменным, потому что это совершенно другой уровень общения.
Guys, knowing that Russians have very skeptical and cynical kind of a perspective on their own political system, they keep saying Russians separate very clearly politicians and average people. So, yes, Olga and Yelena came 2 years ago when President Obama was elected, and they feel that they were absolutely warm feeling and welcoming at Ferry State University. Said they came now under President Trump. They feel the same, that the people, American people in general, are very much like Russians. They warm, they kind, they open-minded. So if we lift the politics out of our everyday life, we actually can probably achieve much more and much further. So that is kind of a general understanding. Mm-hmm.
I can attest to that. When I was in Kazan, I decided, with a little help from my friends back home, to go to a bar in Kazan called Cuba Libre, which was a Cuban-themed bar. And I went there by myself, and I had Coca-Cola while I was there, and drinking, and I met some tourists from Siberia. They lived on a town near the Chinese border, about 3 guys, and we literally hit it off and talked the whole night, going back and forth about how governments get in the way of friendly relationships. And in that time period, where I actually, in all seriousness, I drank a drink, I'm not even sure what it was, but there was like essentially, they put a little drop in, and steam came out of it, like a volcano, like erupting in goodwill. And I drank it, and we thought we had solved all the world's problems that night. These 3 guys, we had an answer for every problem. What to do in Syria, what to do with the Crimea. I mean, in our own way, we had figured out all the problems. And it was just, they were as nice a people as I've ever met anywhere on the planet, basically. So I think there's a lot of truth in what you just said, and I have firsthand experience of that, of all places, in a bar with a Cuban theme.
And I think that even with politics, I think sometimes disengaging from politics, like I am not my politician, don't associate me with Putin, don't associate me with Trump or with Obama, whomever it is, that can be a good coping mechanism because you don't really feel like that person fully represents you. And I think that comes down to the citizenship question that we were asking before. Like, how much control do you feel you have as Russian citizens over your government? How much control do we as Americans feel that we have over our government? I think that since the election of Trump, a lot of us have been having feelings about that and thoughts about that and observations. And so I think this is an interesting moment in history that we're living in right now. So I guess I'll ask the Russians the question first and then we can open it up to some other people.
Yeah. So, Yelena, I was translating the question, Tracy. It says, I think for them to fully understand what you says, for example, how do you feel as American citizen, like citizenship? So would like to just understand the meaning of.
I think, what Christian said is absolutely true, and I've experienced that when I'm in Russia too. It's like, it's like we want to be friends, right? Let's just forget about the politics, because let's admit it, the politics between the United States and Russia the past 100 years have been mostly not friendly. So there's always this sense that you can get these two people together, as individuals, and it'll be a really good thing. And that's basically what I've dedicated my life to, is promoting understanding of Russian history and Russian culture with that idea that government shouldn't be in our way. However, there's also the rub, right, which is that we do belong to our nations. We are citizens of our nations. We elect our representatives. And, at some point that does come to play a role. And, we like to feel, Americans like to feel that we have a voice in our government. So how important is it for you as Russians to feel that you have a voice in your government?
Lena and Olga, as we were talking about, says, it's why I really truly support international projects. They believe that as a citizens, responsible citizens, when they represent Russian culture here in higher education, and they see potential, for American students to learn more about Russia, travel to Russia, feel comfortable with Russia, that we make steps on the level we can control, from citizen to citizen.
Нет, и гранты, которые мы подаем, они поддерживают.
Also, they say if you look at the system of grant system, any type of government support of the collaboration like that, it shows actually goodwill to work together. So if you focus on positive, then you can probably see how you can make a difference in the area you can make a difference. Okay, so that is their response. Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts from the audience? We can open this up to other people too. Matt? You're in the shadows, but I can still recognize you.
Want me to stand up or no?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, Professor Peterson, you kind of brought up the whole Syrian thing and solving the world's problems. I'm kind of curious to know, as Russian citizens,
Еще раз вопрос.
what are your guys' views on what's going on over there in
For
Syria?
кризис в Сирии, что вы об этом знаете?
Well, because I lived on the Syrian border for 8.5 months.
Он был как раз в Сирии 8
I'd like to
месяцев.
see what you guys think
Что
about that.
о чем? Скажи, что вас мало показывают в новостях. Что показывают?
Нет, любая война это ужасно.
Yeah, Russians truly believe that any war is devastating.
И
it's
наша
a
страна
horrible
это
thing.
понимает как никто лучше, потому что до сих пор живы люди, которые пережили Первую
And in Russia, the
мировую
sentiment
войну.
against any type of war, because Russia was one of the one country what suffers the most through the Second World War, and that memory is really very passionate in everyone's heart because every family suffered. We have still cities in countrysides that are in ruin. Purposely, we keep that alive. So the idea that people of Syria suffering is quite painful.
И то, что мы слышим даже вот не только по российским каналам, но, например, Евроньюз, который достаточно популярен в России, это то, что идея совместной борьбы с ИГИЛ, это Соединенных Штатов и России, она принесет успех.
And they're really hoping that Russia and United States will work collaborative to work against ISIS. So it's not war against particular country. It's war against the terrorism and the hateful philosophy, which is using average citizens as a human shield. So they're really hopeful in Russia that, probably in the future, the collaboration at least to shield and protect, because that will make a difference for everyone
И
in the world.
для России этот вопрос особенно важен тем, поскольку, как ты уже говорила, это многонациональное государство, много мусульман, и есть определенные течения, где вербуют из мусульманской
And
молодежи.
also
Это
in
тоже
Russia,
очень
because
важно.
as I told you guys before, it's a multi-ethnic country and very large Muslim population. There's a very clear understanding of danger of brainwashing young people who may become suicide bombers, may join ISIS. So the government is involved in the process of educating people, saying, that ISIS is not Islam. It's not a voice of Muslim people. So that is really important.
В нашем университете учатся более 40 человек
да,
из
из
Сирии.
Сирии.
About 40 students from Syria studies in Kazan National Research University right now. So they had actually a lot of open tables and talk about what country is going through and what their personal concern, because eventually after they graduate, they have to go back home.
Получают инженерное образование.
And they're really hopeful they may go to some other countries that are their home country, because they do feel like they lost their home. The country they left is no longer exist. So it is quite devastating.
It's really one of the best examples of a problem with very few good solutions. I mean, at the end of the day, the U.S. strategy was to try to build a third party that wasn't the al-Assad regime, and to build some type of entity that can hold that society together. It has not worked. The Russians have tended to support the Syrian government and spend a lot more time defending the government than essentially attacking ISIS. The Russians, as a nation, could do a lot more to fight ISIS than they're doing. The problem is, I think the Russians are essentially right that there needs to be some authority. And the United States hasn't come up with anything that can basically take the place of the Syrian government at this point. So you have a situation where you've got two countries that have different understandings of how to address the problem, but they're going to have to come to the middle on some point and do that. And this is not an easy solution, because the Syrian government actually is going to struggle to have control over the country. But at the end of the day, that seems to be the only way to go, because as we Americans, we have to ask ourselves, if it's not al-Assad in power, who is it going to be in Syria? Who's going to run that country? The Obama administration from the beginning said that regime has to go. And he's essentially right. It was a horrific regime. But at the end of the day, Putin does have a point when he says there needs to be some authority. And who is that going to be? So you can go on and on and on with this until somebody establishes something that can actually govern the country. But I do think the American government has a very good point that Russia has spent more time defending the regime and going after people who pose threats to it than attacking ISIS. I think the U.S. is right. I think both countries could do better.
Matt, what are your observations after being on that board?
Probably none that need to be said in this room.
Я сказала, я не могу сказать. Вот вслух не могу сказать, что я пережил там. Yeah.
Okay, Bart? And then
What would you say are some strengths and weaknesses that are displayed by both the U.S. and Russia, and how could they learn from each other?
Плюсы и минусы в России и в Америке, как мы друг от друга можем научиться?
Это очень широкий
It's
вопрос.
a very
It's a very
wide
wide
question. But at least, from my personal point of view, I really admire openness and kindness of American people, forgiveness about our appearances. Yes, in Russia, if you look at those women, compare them to me. Yes, they have.
Молодежь всегда
I
находит.
said, most important is the young people. Says, you will surprise, Raul Ruslan is up there, is a student from Russia. If you look up here, he just fits so organically in a group of students of the United States. So they said, openness, kindness.
Ну, например, здесь мы приехали, мы встречались с преподавателями, мы видим плюсы, например, в методике преподавания,
this,
и
for
мы
example,
готовы
again,
перенять эти.
From purpose of this visit was to see how American way of teaching. So they see a lot of this more informal conversation, interactive teaching methods that our colleagues in Russia would like to learn. So there's definitely benefits on that level. When I just come back with a group of American faculty from Russia, and American faculty were saying, we love that Russian educational system involved parents as a very active part. So if your child suddenly missing classes, as a parent, you get a notice from the university saying something is happening. If you're paying for that education, get involved. Also, they're talking about respect, amount of respect from students to faculty in their work. Nobody finds themselves in 2 years in college. You're in college, it's work, you're on a very clear path to get your degree in 5 years because it's paid by the government, so there's really serious attitude. There's very less forgiving. You know, if you're not capable to sustain college work ethics, you don't belong in college. You may belong in trade school. You may belong somewhere else. We'll help you to find it, but just don't take somebody else's place. Figure it out. You know, so kind of a level of respect and maturity.
Hi there. I understand that you're from the chemistry department. So I was wondering, as far as the educational system, how research grants and different things like that are different there compared to here.
вот
at
исследовательские
research,
работы,
if-
да?
How easy it is to get funding, how important research is.
Финансируется ли?
Финансируются, да, вот курсовые, дипломные работы. Все-таки research, все-таки часть, да?
У нас же образование.
Нет, у нас бесплатное
Бесплатное
образование,
образование.
и все это
нас
делается
есть
в рамках,
стипендии президента.
в рамках обучения. Но если вот то, что вот мы говорим, если человек хочет, например, продолжать свою исследовательскую работу дальше, ну, например, я могу свой пример привести после
Окей.
защиты.
Сейчас
Я
скажешь.
получила PhD и имела...
Because of the research is part of academic process, you know, your college education is free, so you're not paying for your research, it's paid by the government. However, if you would like to continue with some different thing, for example, Professor Gavrilova had her research done in Netherlands and France. So you're finding grants, there's a lot of government grants that support students, gifted students.
И сейчас идет большая поддержка талантливой молодежи со стороны правительства, целенаправленная,
And right now,
которая
actually,
дает деньги на исследования внутри.
Ministry of Education specifically now funding talented young scientists from inside to send them abroad, to give them additional
Нет, и
experiences.
внутри
And
России
inside the Russia as well. So you actually not just getting money for research, but you get money for living expenses and additional money. So that there is very strong support. So
На
people who would
студенты
like to do it, they find money.
повышенную стипендию за
And if
активность.
you are honor students, you actually get paid by the government. You actually receive a grant every month. Not much, it's about $30, but it's free money. So, but again, if you think your education is free, so, you know, that money you can spend. Textbooks are free. You rent them from a library, absolutely. So there's a lot of, сказал, учебники бесплатные у нас, yeah? So if you see, there is a lot of good things we can learn from Russians, yes? That it's, you rent the textbook, it returns back to university cycles, textbooks. So if you want to purchase your own copy, you're welcome to, but it's not forced on you to spend additional $7,000 to $8,000, yes, a year on textbooks. So that is another thing.
Okay, we have a question over here. Go ahead.
Yeah?
Hi, so Russia reportedly deployed a new cruise missile violating an arms control treaty from 1987.
Ой, тестирование нового атомного этого оружия
So how do you
прошли.
think that's going to affect the relations?
Я некомпетентна, чтобы говорить об этом.
Unfortunately, our guests said they just don't have enough information to respond to that question with full knowledge because that is something out of their area of expertise. Yeah.
All right, Stephen?
What do you think it would take to repair relations between our two countries?
Что надо сделать, чтобы сохранить, улучшить отношения России и Америки? Вот последние 8 лет.
We are
отношения-
trying to do it 3 years already, you know. We are coming here and staff from your university coming to Russia, and that's only thing we could do.
Yeah.
Because if this collaboration will continue and will exist, it means that our relationships getting better, better, and better. And for our governments, it's the point. Они не могут пропустить вот
Yeah,
это вот.
it has to become, for example, if many universities, yes, we're talking about universities, collaborate, it becomes impossible for the government to avoid that. So they will see it's possible to communicate and work successfully. That's why for us it's very important we're making small steps. However, those steps have significant importance in your lives and lives of Russian students and life of faculties because we're showing that world is very much the same. Let's not focus on the differences. Let's focus on the similarities.
Trump's point about Obama as a hypocrite?
United States.
Are you talking about the United States record in foreign policy being?
Say just murderer.
Yes.
So innocent, the innocent comment.
Oh, so you're asking me? On some level, yes. I'm not so much debating the validity of the statement. My bigger problem with it, and there we can, I don't have to, we can literally talk about every one of those issues, but I don't think that's going to serve the purpose. What it tends to show me is essentially the reaction of American politics. Like, it's always been assumed. Let's start with Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon said, I'm the only one that can go to China because I'm a Republican, I have an anti-communist record, people won't question me. If a Democrat tries to do that, they will be accused of treason and being soft. My point is, if you have a certain political view in this country, you are seemingly allowed to do things. Let's think about Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, Mr. Warmonger, or that he was portrayed by people, or, he was supposed to be the hero that faced down the Soviet Union, engaged in negotiations, went back to the Moscow summit in '88, signed the INF Treaty, which someone talked about here. What people don't remember is he was accused of essentially being a traitor. Neoconservatives in this country wanted that treaty, which is one of the hallmarks of his administration, they wanted killed. And his point was, Reagan, if you read the documents behind his presidency, it said only Ronald Reagan could do that because Democrats would never have been given the political leeway to do so. So my point is, essentially in my comment, and I can see where you're going with this, is that depending on who you are politically and what you project, you get held to a different standard. And the way it's going, like things like Nixon can go to China, Reagan can go back to the Soviet Union, and Trump can question American exceptionalism in ways that Democrats just can't. Imagine if John Kerry said that, or Obama. I mean, look at the reaction when Obama mildly questioned American exceptionalism early in his presidency. All he said was, Americans are exceptional in the same way that other countries are exceptional, and people went absolutely crazy. I mean, Mitch McConnell even basically criticized Trump. Republicans are criticizing Trump. And I'll be the first to admit, this is a very good question. The United States is not innocent. We've done a lot of terrible things, a lot of good things. Everything's a mixed bag, depending on time and place. What I'm more concerned about is the political reaction to it. And I gauge the reaction of the American public giving leeway to Trump on this issue in ways they wouldn't have given to other people. I mean, my dad, he's a veteran. He thinks he pretty much has the right to do anything. He basically called Hillary Clinton a hater of freedom. And my point is, if she had said that, he would have gone, he's my weather vane for a lot of people in this country. He would have literally lost his mind. But when Trump said, I asked him about it, and he's like, Trump knows what he's doing. Trump knows what he's talking about. So that's more what I'm concerned about, is the double standard of reaction rather than the validity of the charge.
Meg.
Okay. When Russia transferred from the Soviet Union to the Russian Federation, how did the old people feel about that?
Старые люди как чувствовали, когда развалился Союз? And they said, that actually for the older generation, it was quite painful experience. The sentiment that we lost prestige, we lost country that they work for because they grew up and their youth were in Soviet Union. There were a lot of hopes and a lot of dreams. Despite how they play out, you have a nostalgic notion. And said, again, your pensions were guaranteed. So suddenly with economic problems, people start losing money. You start, sliding into the poverty, and physically you're not capable to defend yourself, against this very aggressive free market economy. So it was really quite difficult time, yes.
Не только для пожилых людей, но я могу сказать на своем опыте. Когда случилась перестройка, я училась в аспирантуре.
So also, not only for old people, but like Елена, Professor Gabriel was saying, she was a graduate student when перестройка happened.
И я знала, что если я получу степень, я займу должность определенную в факультете, и я буду иметь достаточную зарплату, которая позволит
And if
мне
as a
жить.
graduate student in Soviet Union, you knew if you're finishing your PhD, you have good defense, you can guarantee a job with very comfortable income. So there was a hope, there was stability.
А получилось, что до того, как я уехала на постдок в Голландию, я торговала морякей.
And says when she finished her PhD, suddenly that all of that stability was gone. She was forced to sell Mary Kay cosmetics. with PhD in chemistry, to make actually decent lifestyle. So for a lot of people, it was really quite difficult time.
Конечно, времена потом
And
поменялись, и
some
я
people
заняла свою
adjust,
позицию.
yes,
Да,
and
но-
you survive, but some people don't adjust, so that's unfortunate, but it's what free market is, yes? You swim or you sink. I know there was a question out there, yes?
My little brother was adopted from Krasnodar. He has many developmental delays, and his upbringing was quite
Больной ребенок с
impoverished.
Краснодара.
And I oftentimes wonder where he would have ended up if he had stayed in Russia.
Если бы его
He
не
lives
взяли,
in an
говорит, что бы с ним
adult home
случилось?
that's
Он был
paid
в
for
детском
by
доме был.
Medicaid in America. So I'm curious, do you guys have systems in place to take care of
Социальная
the
структура есть у
children
нас?
that grew
Да,
up without parents
Да.
during the collapse of
Сейчас
the Soviet
уже
Union,
есть.
and for people that are developmentally challenged in your country?
То есть, если не усыновляют, так же, как вот здесь вот, да,
Just a second, let me respond and I will translate.
то, значит, их обучают в детском доме каким-то определенным профессиям, и после достижения совершеннолетия, когда они покидают детский дом, да, их обеспечивают жильем и работой.
There is a social structure for the children who have developmental issues. If they don't get adopted, what government strongly encourage actually to provide them family because it's the best way, yes, to give them normal childhood and protected adulthood. If they do have ability to obtain some kind of a trade, basic manual trade because mental ability are limited or physical ability are limited, for example, limited hearing or limited sight, government responsible by age 18, when you no longer can sustain and facilities, the state facilities, they receive apartment, they will be employed by the government, and they will be under government protection. So
Например,
Protection, you mean like assistance, life skills?
life skills assistance, absolutely. So they will be, but again,
их не могут уволить.
they
Они
cannot
не
be
могут-
fired from job.
Они не могут продать квартиру,
They
потому
cannot
что...
sell their apartment. So because they are no longer can be victim of someone who is preying, yes, on a person who may not make a full independent decision. So, and obviously there will be structure in place. For example, medical assistant, yes, if it needs to be, or social worker will come at least once a week and check on them and help them with basic skills like grocery shopping,
Ну, надо
mail.
признать, что в Соединенных Штатах внимание к таким людям
But
гораздо
our
больше.
friends can see that obviously in the United States, that particular system is much better.
Yeah.
Our society is better addressing issues with mental problems, with physical disabilities, even in educational field and everywhere else. So it's definitely United States are far ahead addressing those issues.
Can I add something to that? Putin, he gave a speech on this subject. I just remember reading many years ago. He said one of the biggest problems of the Soviet Union was the poor treatment of people with disabilities. And you get a feel for that and some of you are probably old enough to remember this, not all of you. 1980 Olympics in Moscow, which the U.S. boycotted. It was understood that in the Olympics, the Special Olympics would be held in the same city that essentially did the regular Olympics. The Soviet Union refused to hold Special Olympics. And the reason Brezhnev gave, and you can go read this in any newspaper, he was pretty open with it, that the Soviet Union didn't have to hold the Special Olympics because they didn't have any disabled people. That was his essential reaction. It reminds me of comments like, we have no AIDS in various African countries, or Iran that says we don't have any gay people, things like this. I mean, it's utterly preposterous. I mean, in a country, there's a lot of suffering, and the basic issue there were war veterans are walking around the city that would have basically horrific war wounds from defending the Soviet Union against the Nazis that anyone could see. So I do think, I don't want to be misunderstood, but I think Russia has done a lot to address that issue, even if they're not up to U.S. standards, at least in that case. I think they're correct on that.
Yeah, but also our Russian friends said if you look right now in Special Olympics, Russia does have the represented. Yes,
Yeah.
so they have actually people now have ability. Unfortunately, when we were same thing kind of question was raised last week when we were in Russia with our group of students from doctorate program. They said we don't see any elevators in the buildings. How does mobility, people with mobility difficulties get education, and they all have to be distant learners, unfortunately. Right now, new facilities are built to accommodate wheelchair However, right now, people who have hearing or vision limitation can attend normal classes. So there is, that issue is addressed. But sometimes universities are in historical buildings from 19th centuries, before elevators were invented. So then it's present challenges. And again, Russian universities don't have campuses, guys, like city inside the city. It's buildings across town. So if you have one class in this building, you may have to take a bus to different. If you do have a wheelchair, it's sometimes physically impossible. So that is another. It's not just Russia. It's most European universities are built that way. Yes. Yeah.
See, stand up.
I see just a hand. Oh, okay. All right.
Do you guys believe that Putin's anti-LGBT agenda
Путин
empowers
против
ISIS?
геев. Что говорит?
He wants to,
Не акцентировал.
I don't know if it empowers ISIS per se. Well, I think it has more to do with the reaction to, excuse me. In a nutshell, there was a big Western Russian reaction against the onslaught of Western kind of values and modernity. What I mean by that is liberal democracy in terms of universal values, human rights. There's a lot of articles that I've read in journals suggesting that the Russians do not want to emulate the life in the United States. So they see it as permissiveness and all this stuff. I think Putin mainly, that agenda has been pushed as it's proven popular with many Russians. At least that's what I can tell. If I'm wrong, they can correct me. But what I read from countries is a lot of people see it as a reaction. We don't want to be like Western countries where anything goes. We have our own values, and part of that is the anti-LGBT agenda. And Putin's very savvy about it because he portrays it as not being essentially anti-LGBT, as essentially, he paints it as propaganda. But it certainly can be interpreted that way. So my answer to your question is, I think it's meant to basically make him more popular domestically, and it plays well with a lot of Russians who see it as a reaction against values being pushed on them by the West.
Yeah, I just ask, what in average, how they see rights of sexual minorities, presented. So it's very, very normal. People don't feel like it's anything special. It's how you were born. Yes, nobody tried to cure you with electric shocks or anything. And however, they sometimes feel that maybe it's a personal question, and if you're comfortable talking about it, great.
Нет, к этому не привлекается никакого
Yeah.
внимания,
So
например, как
does
в
not-
Израиле демонстрируют свадьбы геев и так далее. Да? То есть
So
этого нет,
it's kind of
конечно.
addressed more as a personal matter. So it's not, people feel uncomfortable when, for example, publicly demonstrating, hugging, kissing. It's not just for people with non-traditional sexual orientation. In average, it's just considered inappropriate, okay? It's okay to hug each other, but, not make out in the public subway in Moscow. You may be scolded, say, get a room, same thing like in America. I found America quite traditional and conservative in that matter. Same thing, Russian people don't talk about religion in public. It's very private matter for everyone, and they kind of keep it to themselves.